Okay, well, it's a pleasure to join you all today. So what I thought I would do was, well, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction as to who I am. Then I was going to say a little bit about, so my main area of interest is climate change. So I was going to tell you a little bit of the sort of the latest updates in terms of the science around climate change, and then tell you what we're doing in the university in response to climate change. So let me just share my screen. Okay. Right, so I thought I'd start off with this. It's oh no, hang on a minute, there we go. It's going too many forwards. It's the maze at the moment in Cambridge. So I was down at the river yesterday watching the rowing, and you'll be sad to know that both the men's first date and the women's first date both got bumped, I'm afraid, yesterday. But this was me back in 2005 when we got blades in the maze, and I'm there rowing at number 4. So I came to Trinity in.
You're in the picture here. You're in the picture. You're in this picture.
I'm in this picture at number 4, rowing at number 4.
Number 4 from the right, I guess.
From the well, yes, from the back of the boat. If you go
back of the boat, from the cocks.
Yeah. No, from the cocks. If you go back 5 from the cocks, then you get to me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've got sunglasses on there.
Oh, okay. I can see. Great.
So yeah, I arrived in 1994 to do part 3 maths, and then I did a PhD and was spent a year as a Rouse Ball Scholar before then moving to Darwin College, where I was then a research fellow. So that's my background. But the area of mathematics that I focused on was very much applied mathematics, and applied mathematics focused on fluid dynamics and the fluid dynamics of the atmosphere and oceans. So the first topic area that I really focused on in terms of applications was what at the time was the significant environmental problem, which is the ozone hole. And my first trips to the polar regions, and you can see some photographs from that, my first trip to the polar regions was actually to the Arctic, where we were taking measurements associated with ozone depletion in the Arctic. And this was a big joint research campaign between the Europeans and the Americans. And you can see the various NASA planes that were taking part in those measurements. And if you look at the picture right in the center at the bottom, it's probably the most interesting scientifically. What you see in the polar regions is in sort of early springtime, you can see there are clouds in the sky that have those sort of rainbow patterns associated with them. And those are called polar stratospheric clouds. They're clouds that form very high up in the atmosphere in very cold temperatures. And the chemistry of the atmosphere, what happens is that CFCs, the chemicals that were used as refrigerants or in aerosol cans, particularly, make their way high up into the atmosphere. And when they meet those clouds in the polar regions in winter and early spring, then chemical reactions occur that release the chlorine out of the CFCs. And that chlorine is then able to destroy the ozone, and that's the chemical processes associated with ozone depletion. So those clouds are very beautiful, but they're associated with the processes that lead to ozone depletion. So that was the first significant research that I was involved in the Arctic, and the first field campaign that I was involved in. And then I spent significant amount of time in the Antarctic. And in the Antarctic, my focus changed from the atmosphere to the oceans. And I was still interested in the fluid dynamics of the oceans. again, combination of taking measurements and then using those measurements to help better understand that fluid dynamical processes. And in particular, we were interested now with a major focus on climate change. We were particularly interested in understanding mixing processes in the ocean. The Southern Ocean is particularly important because it's the only part of the world's oceans where the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean are all connected together. It's the only part of the world's oceans where you have a circumpolar ocean where you can go around all latitudes in the ocean. And that actually means that the fluid dynamics are somewhat different to other ocean basins. The fact that you don't have continental boundaries means that the overall flow of the ocean is different, and the processes determining that are different. And the other reason that the Southern Ocean is particularly important from a fluid dynamics perspective is that there's a vast global overturning circulation of the ocean where water in a very slow process sinks down in the north, particularly north of Scotland, makes its way down the Atlantic and then comes up to the surface around Antarctica in the Southern Ocean. And when it comes up to the surface, it's able to exchange heat and carbon dioxide and other gases with the atmosphere before it then sinks down and continues on its pathway. So understanding the processes that bring that water up to the surface in the Southern Ocean.
We had sorry to interrupt, we had a similar discussion with former Vice Chancellor Gray Worcester. Yes. Who seems to be working on very similar, or did you cooperate with him?
Yes, indeed, yeah. So great and I've worked together.
Sounds very similar work.
He's been, so you see the bottom right picture there is a picture of sea ice, and one of the things that Gray has worked a lot on is sea ice and understanding the fluid dynamics associated with sea ice. So that's some of the things, and I spent quite a number of research trips in Antarctica, and yeah, it's a huge privilege to spend time in either polar region, but to have gone to both polar regions is, yeah, feel very.
Have you been to the South Pole? Have you been
Not to the South Pole? No, no. The UK base, the main UK base, is on the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the bit of Antarctica that sticks up towards South America. Well, in fact, actually, don't know, you can see on, I've got a map behind here. It's the bit that sticks up over there. So it's quite a long way from South Pole. So that's the sort of background in terms of some of the things that I've been involved in the past. I thought I'd just give you this sort of dashboard of where things are at a global scale in terms of climate change right now, and also a couple of slides that I've got where I'm just going to introduce some of the things that have been coming out again at a global scale in terms of the science over the last 12 months, and where quite a number of people from Cambridge have been involved in that process. So the global coordination around climate science is undertaken by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which in a hugely collaborative process produces reports every 5 years or so. And those reports are divided into 3 sections, one that's focused more on the physics and our physical understanding of how the climate has changed. That's working group 1. Working group 2 is more of bringing in more of the social sciences, and in particular looking at the impacts of climate change and how that impacts communities. And then the 3rd working group is more focused around the economics and the technology. And we've had people from Cambridge involved in each of those different aspects. This slide here speaks mostly to the physics side of it, and the quote at the top comes from that first working group report on the physics. So this shows in just 3 graphs how the world's been changing over the last 150 years. Huge increase in carbon dioxide levels. Carbon dioxide levels are now at 420 parts per million in the atmosphere. Temperatures are 1.1 degrees Celsius hotter than they were 150 years ago. It's actually recent assessments indicate that there's a 50-50 chance that temperatures will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming in at least one of the next 5 years. And you can see also there's been a steady rise in sea level as well. And that steady rise in sea level has happened essentially for 2 reasons. Partly because as the atmosphere has been warming up, the ocean's been warming up, and when the water in the ocean warms up, it literally expands in volume and occupies a larger amount of the sort of ocean basins, and that causes sea level rise. But also as the atmosphere has been warming up, ice around the world has been melting, and where that ice is sat on land, it's found its way into the oceans, and that's caused about 50% of the sea level rise we've seen in recent times. But the overarching statement from the assessment of the physical aspects of climate change is that the impacts of climate change have now been detected in every region across the globe in terms of wildfires and droughts and floods and so forth. And, you know, with that's in terms of the graphs, in terms of pictures, then we've seen increasing loss of ice from Greenland and Antarctica in recent times, huge reduction in the amount of Arctic sea ice. And it's not just those changes in terms of the changes that are directly related to warming, but there are also many other implications of those high levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And one of them is that the high levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are making their way into the oceans, and we're seeing really significant acidification of the oceans as a consequence. And it's estimated that the rate of acidification is higher than has been seen in at least 26,000 years, quite possibly very much longer than that. And that's causing severe stress to much of the marine life. So the second working group report from the IPCC, the one that's more focused on the social science side of things, really highlights the impact on people, but also on nature in terms of climate change and the risks associated with increased levels of warming. So I said that there's a risk that 50-50 chance that in the next 5 years we'll surpass 1.5 degrees of warming, and doing so really starts to significantly increase the risks across a whole range of different measures. One of the headlines from the report earlier this year was that it's estimated that half the world's population live in climate vulnerable hotspots. Another key concern about going up in terms of the amount of warming is that there's a real concern that we might pass thresholds which create essentially irreversible changes in many important aspects of the climate system. And there's just 3 examples on the right hand side there of where there's particular concerns. The first is in terms of the Amazon rainforest, where there's a concern that combination of climate change and deforestation may tip that from being a rainforest environment into a savanna environment. The second is looking at the ice sheets in the polar regions, where there's real concern that moving above 1.5 degrees of warming could result in the loss of the vast ice sheets covering Greenland and West Antarctica, which would eventually lead to significant amounts of sea level rise. And the bottom example, the little circle that you see there is actually a bubble of methane that's coming out of an Arctic lake as the Arctic lake warms. And the concern there is that there are vast stores of frozen methane in the Arctic, either at the bottom of lakes or the ocean or in the permafrost in the land. And methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So there'll be a great concern about the impacts of methane being released as a consequence of warming. So we're increasingly trying to understand the consequences of the risks associated with climate change. And one of the things that we're trying to understand is understand the impacts of those risks at quite a fine scale, so that we can start to look at specific locations and understand the risk, particularly of extreme weather in those locations. And one of the things that we're doing in Cambridge significantly now in terms of our research is using machine learning and AI to bring together greater numbers of data sets to get better information, particularly around the risk of extreme weather events. And the image that you see at the top there is a project that I and my students have been undertaking to do exactly that. And the headline statement from that study was that in many parts of the world, the risk of disruption from extreme hot days over the coming decades is likely to increase not just by a few weeks a year, but by, in some instances, several months a year. And the other thing that we've been doing quite a lot of work on is looking in different contexts what the implications of that are. So we've done a lot of work looking at the implications for national security, because many of these climate impacts can feed into the drivers of conflict and migration, and that has significant security implications. But also looking at the impacts on food and water and other critical supplies, and how that can have impacts not just in the region in which the climate change is occurring, but end up having global impacts through our dependencies globally on those resources. We're also really interested in understanding the interconnection more widely. So climate change is already affecting lives and livelihoods around the world, but at the same time, the world is under significant pressure from many other environmental threats, particularly in terms of biodiversity. And it's estimated that 1 million species are at risk of extinction over the coming decades, and that risk exacerbated by climate change. Deforestation causes its own challenges, and I've mentioned that in the context of the Amazon. The scale of deforestation globally is astonishing. It's estimated that tropical forest the size of England is lost each year, and that has an impact both on the biodiversity and on climate change. And then all of this also sits in a world where we're seeing increasing levels of inequality, both within countries and between countries. And I mentioned that it's estimated that 50% of the world lives in climate vulnerable hotspots, and part of that vulnerability is exacerbated by those inequalities. So all of these issues are interconnected with each other. So the third and final working group of the IPCC looks at the economics and also the pathways for responding to climate change. One of the key statements that came out of that, has been global political agreement to keep temperatures well below 2 degrees of warming, with an ambition to keep them below 1.5 degrees of warming. But I already mentioned that there's a 50-50 risk of temperatures exceeding 1.5 degrees over the next 5 years. The amount of emissions that occurred over the last 10 years are, in totality, the amount that's left in the carbon budget for staying below 1.5 degrees. So if we continued over the next 10 years to emit in the same way, there would be no more that we could emit in terms of emissions if we wanted to stay below 1.5 degrees. So there's a real urgency in terms of emissions reductions, and it's quite clear that we need to be reducing our emissions significantly more than any of the country pledges that have been put forward to date. And of course, that's at national and international level, but it trickles down in terms of our own individual organisations, and is the key driver of what we're doing in the university in Cambridge for determining our emissions reductions, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So this is the sort of global picture of what the current emissions of carbon dioxide in particular have been in the white dots, and the pathway that the world needs to be on if there's a reasonable chance of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And you can see we're not currently on that pathway. So last year in Glasgow, nations came together and the Glasgow Climate Pact was agreed, which went incrementally closer towards the necessary global response. One of the headline statements from that Glasgow Climate Pact was this statement that accelerated action is required in this critical decade. And of course, what then happened, this Glasgow Climate Pact happened in November last year. We then had the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the consequent impact that's had around the world in terms of cost of living, which has only made this even more challenging to respond to. So that's the sort of global context. What I want to just talk about now, and then we can maybe have some discussion and you can ask me more questions on this, is how the University of Cambridge is responding to that global situation. We, 2.5 years ago, set up Cambridge Zero, and Cambridge Zero is the university's response to the climate crisis. And there's essentially 4 areas in which we are focusing our activities, which cover the 4 areas of greatest influence of the university. So one is research, the other is education. The third is all our external engagements, whether that's with policy or industry or the public more generally. And then finally is the university's own operations and how we look to decarbonize and make more sustainable the university's own operations. So if I just give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the things we're doing across each of those different dimensions, a huge amount going on in the university in terms of research that is related to climate change and responding to climate change. And I've just highlighted some of the big areas of research activity. There's a lot of research being undertaken across the university in terms of a zero carbon energy transition. If I just pick out some of the highlights amongst that, we're leading in terms of some of the developments of new battery technologies. Batteries are essential for electric vehicles, but also for putting in place huge batteries to help with new energy generation systems at a national level, where you have increasing intermittent renewable energy from solar or wind. You need to combine that with grid scale battery storage technology to manage to cope with that intermittency of supply. And also a lot of research in the university, for example, on looking at new fuels and how we might be able to create new sustainable fuels. In terms of the health and society, there's 2 dimensions to the research that's being undertaken on this. Really significant research now looking at the health impacts of climate change across many different dimensions. You will probably be aware that the current master at Trinity has particular interest in antimicrobial resistance. And it actually turns out that there's a really strong connection between climate change and antimicrobial resistance, because some of the hotspots of increased antimicrobial resistance happen in areas of poor sanitation, and much of those areas of poor sanitation, that sanitation aspect is exacerbated where there's flooding events. And so climate change can feed into that and exacerbate it. But there's also significant research in the university looking at new ways in which we're starting to understand the climate impacts on health, in particular, the impact of extreme temperatures on human immune systems and the way in which extreme temperatures can have an adverse impact on human immune systems. And the other half of this is looking at society, and that's really looking at behavioural responses to climate change and understanding the psychology associated with that. In terms of the resources and production, huge amounts of research that's being undertaken, some of it on the crop science side of things. We've got a relatively new Centre for Crop Science in the university, and there's a lot of work being undertaken on that, looking at climate resilient crops and how we can transition food and land use in a net zero world. And then the other side of this, on the production side, a lot of interest in supporting more circular economy and many different dimensions looking at that. If I then move down to the bottom row, resilient futures, a significant part of that is looking at sustainable finance and how we might be able to not only, well, one key element of that is how we can bring together our scientific expertise, our computer science expertise, and our finance expertise to help provide the underpinning data sets to inform what sustainable finance might look like. So in particular, we're looking at ways of bringing in climate-related and nature-related data into financial services, working a lot with the Judge Business School and others associated with that. In terms of transport, cities and infrastructure, on the transport side of things, again, I'll just highlight one of many different pieces of research that's been undertaken. Significant amount of work being undertaken looking at net zero aviation, particularly led out of the engineering department. And in terms of cities infrastructure, again, I'll just pick one aspect, and that's work that's being undertaken looking at how we can use natural construction materials, so particularly using more wood in terms of our construction, including in large skyscrapers. And then the final area that I've highlighted here is carbon drawdown and climate repair. So this is in part about how do we remove carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, either by technological means or by looking to work with nature, restoring peatlands and mangroves, for example, to naturally draw down the carbon from the atmosphere. And then looking at whether or not the ways in which we might be able to actually repair some aspects of the climate system. So that's the education side of things, research side of things. On the education side of things, we're really looking across the board of education that the university provides or is involved in. So we're looking at all the courses that we teach our undergraduates and looking at how we can incorporate more climate and sustainability into those courses. We are working with the University of Cambridge Primary School, which is associated with the Department for Education, and looking at how we can input into school education curriculum, including through Cambridge University Press and Assessment. And then we're also doing a significant amount on the executive education side of things. I mentioned a minute ago the Judge Business School, and we're doing a lot with the Judge Business School now around climate and sustainability. And we're hoping that we're going to be launching a stream within the MBA program specifically focused on sustainability. So a lot happening across the education portfolio. In terms of our broader engagements, there, again, across the piece, we're doing a significant amount on climate and sustainability, whether that's our interactions with business and industry, whether it's the public engagement activities that we're doing, the work that we're doing, engaging with on the policy side of things, the things we're doing more broadly in the community, particularly in terms of the local government. We're working closely with the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority, for example, looking to help the local region transition in terms of climate change. And the area that we're just starting to really focus on is how we can build on Cambridge's expertise on entrepreneurship to really stimulate green entrepreneurship, and not just green entrepreneurship happening in Cambridge, but how we can support green entrepreneurship happening everywhere. So there's a big focus on that aspect now. And then the final area of university activity where there's a lot of work going on is decarbonisation. It's a big challenge both for the university and all the colleges. And so I work closely with Trinity in terms of Trinity's own plans around decarbonisation and sustainability more generally. I thought I'd just give you one example of the sorts of things that we're thinking on the more ambitious end of decarbonisation. So this image here shows you the West Cambridge campus. I don't know how to orientate you here, but the top is Madingley Road moving out towards the M11, if you remember that. And so Trinity is off, if you need to continue off down on the right hand side. I was
about 13 years at the Cavendish, so I recognize I was.
Okay, yeah, you can see the old Cavendish building there.
Right.
And so I'm actually sitting currently in the computer lab, which is also on that picture just further up from the Cavendish. And some of the buildings just across the way from us are the new Cavendish, which is currently being built. But what we are interested in doing is thinking about how we can turn this West into an exemplar decarbonised zero carbon and nature campus, which not only is decarbonised in terms of its infrastructure, but it's also a centre for excellence in terms of the research that's being undertaken, how we can use the buildings and the site itself as a test bed for some of the research activities that are focused on zero carbon. So there's work that's being conducted in the Cavendish actually on stacked photovoltaics, and so can we test some of that out in the on some of the buildings? Can we test some of the smart digital infrastructure on some of the buildings? And also, can we make this into, I mentioned a focus that we now have on green entrepreneurship. Can we make this into a real centre for green entrepreneurship? Cambridge Enterprise now sits on this campus as well. So that's some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of how we combine the decarbonisation of the university itself with something more than that, where we can create real flagships for some of the activities. And I'll just give you one other example of where we're trying to do that, which is sort of related to some aspects of this plot. So one of the other buildings on this West Campus site currently is the vet school. And the other area where we're looking to see where we can create a real kind of exemplar is the university farm, which is associated with the vet school. So again, seeing can we not only look to create exemplar sustainability processes, but combine that with the research side of the university as well, so that it's a test bed for some of those more innovative technologies. So the very last thing that I thought I'd say, just a couple of the highlights of the things that we've done recently, that just give you an example of what, by this greater focus on climate change, we've been able to achieve in the university. Huge research centre that we've recently launched, the Centre for Landscape Regeneration. That brings together 40 senior academics from 15 departments of the university to focus on looking at ways in which landscapes can be regenerated for the benefit of climate and nature and the people living in those landscapes. And it's an example where we're just bringing together a huge range of expertise from across the university. Another example is another institute we've recently launched, which is the Institute of Computing for Climate Science. That is an example where we have developed this institute in Cambridge, but it's supporting a wide range of projects that are not only happening in Cambridge, but are happening in other institutions around the world. So we're kind of acting as a hub for a global network of research. So both of those are really exciting ways in which we can have much greater influence than we might have had before And then on the policy engagement side, we've similarly been able to have much greater influence than we've ever had before. So there you go. That's a bit of a sort of, there's a huge amount that we're doing in the university. And I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a flavour of that, so you can see at least in some sense the amount of different activity that's now being underway.
That was a fantastic overview, Emily. Wonderful. Very, very impressive. Just before, I have a couple of questions, but before I ask, I worked long time in the Cavendish, and the Cavendish, where I worked was number 2, like Cavendish 2.0. No? The number 1 is with a crocodile. No? And number 3 is just being built right now. And is that being rebuilt to zero energy, zero emission already, or is that going to be a retrofit? Because you mentioned the Cavendish.
No. So there's, the key thing there is that is using ground source heat. And so there were huge boreholes that were, before the building was put up, there were huge boreholes that were dug across the site so that ground source heating could be used as the main energy source.
Oh wow!
So yes, it is being. It's not going to be a retrofit. It's going to be
heat pumps.
It's being done. Yeah.
Yeah. And solar on the roof, or?
Yeah, I'm actually not sure. They haven't got to the roof yet. I know the main thing is the ground source heat pumps.
Of course. The solar on the roof is easy to retrofit, but yeah. I have one question. Is I found on YouTube, I found your talk, which was at the Judge School Center of Risk Studies in December 2011, where you said that we need to reduce greenhouse emissions dramatically by 2017, which is now already 5 years ago. And now when you listen to what governments plan, usually that is formulated with targets by 2050, 50, which is of course long after these politicians who make these announcements retire or lose the elections or even die. And so it's easy for them to promise things for 2050. No? So, I mean, in many of the talks I have listened to you on YouTube, you emphasize the urgency. And on the other hand, you read reports, analysis where they report that not much change is actually happening. So how do you see this, like on this, how do you say, this confrontation of the urgency, which is given by the scientific data, and then on the other hand, what actually happens?
Yeah, well, that's not the same, is it? I mean, so yes, but as I say, the numbers get ever closer all the time. So it was agreed in Paris, which is now 8 years ago or so, when the came together in Paris to keep temperatures well below 2 degrees, with an ambition to keep them below 1.5 degrees. And then very little has happened since in terms of actual emissions reductions globally. And so we're now in a place where it looks like within the next 5 years, we'll probably go above 1.5 degrees. So, but that's not to say that nothing's happened though. So in many countries, particularly from the energy sector, emissions have been reducing, and many countries, electric vehicles are now really starting to be rolled out. And so emissions from the transport sector hopefully will start to fall as well. So it's not as though there's been no progress, it's just there's not been fast enough progress.
I mean, one thing, just 2 days ago, I read that the pension fund of the Church of England is putting pressure on Toyota to accelerate the introduction of electric vehicles, because according to the opinion of the Church of England, which the pension fund of the Church of England, Toyota isn't moving fast enough. So that is really something which wouldn't have happened 5 years ago, I guess. So
yeah, and in terms of university and college investments, well, you said last time I joined this group was with Richard, and both Trinity and the university are also putting pressure through their investments on companies to move faster. And I think we're trying to do the same through the research that we're undertaking in the university as well.
There was one, thank you. There was one question by, let's see, Mr. Akasaka. How can I find him? Akasaka-san, hello.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Kyo Akasaka. I was a Japanese diplomat. I used to be a negotiator for the Japanese government on climate change. I took part in the Kyoto conference in 1997. It's a long time ago. My question is about the impact, your views on the impact of the war in Ukraine and the economic sanctions by the West on Russian fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal. This war and the effects of the sanctions will help, ironically, help the reduction of CO2s and greenhouse gases by making the Western countries move towards renewable energy, away from oil, natural gas, and coal. I would like to hear your views.
It's complicated. So as you say, the first impact of Ukraine has been an energy crisis in many countries of the world. And the response of national governments to that, including in the UK, could have been to further prioritize a transition to locally produced renewable energy and to greater efficiencies. In the UK, one of our biggest challenges is in terms of the insulation of retrofitting insulation of homes. That's something that can have an immediate impact on households' bills, and therefore you might think from a policy perspective would be a good investment in the current situation. Instead, what's been happening in the UK is that, and in other countries, is there's been a immediate refocusing on traditional oil and gas. And in the UK, the response has been to say, we're going to open up and indeed encourage further oil and gas extraction from the North Sea, which neither makes sense in the context of climate change, nor does it make sense in terms of the timescales, because you simply can't, any investment today in terms of new infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure, it's not going to deliver any new gas coming on stream for a decade. So it's not going to solve today's energy crisis. But the politics are such that that's what's been happening. So unfortunately, although it could have been positive for energy transition, the current indications are that it hasn't been. The other big challenge, which I think is yet to really emerge, we are starting to hear significantly about the impacts of cost of living, primarily through the lens of energy prices. But the other impact that's starting to be felt is the impact on food prices. And the food security challenge associated with Ukraine is, I think, yet to be fully realized, but will also be significant. Now, all of that similarly plays into the climate negotiations. The next, I mentioned Glasgow in November of last year. We've got COP27 coming up, and everything that I am being told is that every country of the world is very focused on cost of living at the moment, because that's a big issue, and that has inevitably taken the focus off the climate response at a time when we needed to be seeing an acceleration of climate response. I suspect it's the key intended focus of COP27 was particularly around adaptation. And so I think it's particularly unfortunate because that's an area of climate policy that's often been somewhat overlooked. I think it's particularly unfortunate that there's been not the amount of focus in the run-up to COP26 that you might have hoped for.
Thank you.
Do you have more questions, Kyo?
No, that's fine.
It's fine.
Thank you.
Good.
Yes.
Good. Next question, Karen Wang. You have a question. Do you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Emily. And I totally agree, like the adaptation is less focused compared with mitigation. So today I'm actually in this conference hosted by World Bank. So the entire thing, like finance world discussion is really like everyone's urged to bring more, especially private capital to climate. But the big question behind something, my question is around, you mentioned about data. So in terms of climate related data application in climate change, I think we can only manage well what is good measured. This is also like my working and studying background practice of statistics, trying to find a particular area like how we can use this machine learning or like this certain field to help, for example, like climate risk assessment. So something I realized right now is, for example, like a physical risk is mostly assessed by historical catastrophic, like especially in banks. So I think those are like really limited and also not forward-looking manners of measuring the risk. And also in terms of carbon footprint reporting as another topic, I really suspect because like right now the reporting, even like a CDP is heavily rely on manual input. So I mean, I've been coming up with this question to a lot of people in this field, like is that reliable ways of reporting? Like if we're creating solutions based on not solid data foundation, then like I think that would be really questionable if we can really make efficient usage of the resource we have. So yeah, it's a long one, but I think like it's more like want to hear more about any interesting research topics happening in this sector of data and climate. Thank you so much.
Let me just say a couple of things just about finance, climate finance, and then I'll dive into the data thing. So as a international level, climate finance, both for mitigation and for adaptation, have long been big issues. So the developed world had promised £100 billion per year for predominantly climate mitigation to the developing world, and that's still not been realized, and it's an issue of significant trust within the international negotiations. On the adaptation side, in Glasgow, it was promised to double the funding for climate adaptation to the developing world. Currently, that amounts to about just under $20 billion a year. In 2019, that was the number that was provided. Doubling that would take it to closer to $40 billion a year, but it's estimated that more like $300 billion is required. So it's still a big gap compared to what is required on the adaptation side of things. That's the public finance side of things. The other big aspect is the private sector finance and unlocking private sector finance. And one of the other big developments that came out of Glasgow was the private sector coming together under something that is called GFANZ. So there's an increasing number of people, organizations that are involved in GFANZ, and amount of private capital that's under management under that framework. But that's not unrelated to your second question on the data, because one of then the key things that's required under all of those, well, particularly on the private finance side of things, is the data to inform ESG indices and any of the assessments, either on the risk side or in terms of what's actually being undertaken with offsetting, for example. Any of this requires data to inform the standards and metrics. And at the moment, there's a big diversity of different indices and metrics and standards that don't often align with each other. It's a bit of a mess, to be honest. And one thing that we're really trying to do from the university side of things is to see how we can try to unify some of that. Some of it's about creating international standards. Some of it's about working with other institutions to unlock data sets that are sometimes proprietary. There's a lot of work to be done to create a robust and unified framework.
Okay, does that answer your question, Karen?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, like everyone's trying to build their own protocol. As I'm from China, and then like China also has its own ones across different sectors. And then given China just launched a carbon trading mechanism last year, and then also created sort of tractions, like company curious about how and then motivations they got involved. So definitely think the data foundation of carbon reporting is really important thing that we need to have corporate to speak the same language. So thank you so much.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead, Edward. Hi.
I didn't introduce myself.
Yeah, introduce yourself, please. Yes.
Yeah, I left Cambridge in 1972. I was at Trinity College. Funny enough, I'm coming up to one of their annual gatherings next month, and I don't know if it's possible, and I'll tell you why in a moment, Emily, if it's possible that I could meet you on at some stage, if you were available on either this day or the next day, I would greatly appreciate it. And I'll tell you for why. I'm a property developer, commercial property developer, and we've been doing a lot of research over the last year or so to establish two things, really. One in a purely commercial sense, which is there real momentum now behind climate change compliance adoption? And the conclusion we've come to is, which is I think a positive conclusion, is that yes, there is real momentum. And that partly comes from the sort of work that you're doing, Emily, being published, partly comes from government legislation, and it partly comes from kind of the acceptance of the Greta Thunbergs, the David Attenboroughs, the climate change stuff generally, protesters generally, and they move, all that's move from the fringe to the center. So quite what changed it, I think it's very difficult to say, but it's certainly in my world of property, which is incredibly old-fashioned, incredibly slow-moving, very conservative, very profit-orientated, and has no wish to spend money where it believes it will not produce a return. But something's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, and this has been going on for 30 years. I mean, 20 something years ago, I used to get asked to go and talk at I think they were called energy conservation conferences, and I said, look, it's a marvelous idea, and everybody should be trying to do it for their own pockets and the environment generally. But I said, the problem is that nobody cares, or at least in the commercial world, nobody cares enough. Well, that I genuinely believe has just changed, but it's taken 25 years to change, which is quite remarkable, but something's flipped. And I don't know whether it was the global motor car industry being caught cheating, or something else that provided sort of Western government motivation to start sitting up and looking at things. We'll probably never really understand why the motor car industry took such a cynical attitude to actually, physically find ways of cheating compliance with standards. remarkable thing. Anyway, it's cost them a lot of money, but it's probably been a factor in accelerating acceptance of, you know, the issues which are greenhouse gas emissions. I've tried to sort of make having now accepted that this is a real fact. Nobody quite knows what the figures are, but maybe you know, but people tell me that the built environment represents something like 60% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the Western world. Now, it seems to me whether it's 30% or it's 50%, it doesn't really matter. It's still a big number. And that's everything from hospitals to schools and everything in between. So anyway, there is a big change. It's the biggest change in the commercial property development business that's occurred for many, many years. Well, ever actually, probably. And you know, the optimistic note I would just say is that you know, the prognosis is optimistic, slow but optimistic. But you know, what I am doing now is only taking it's a very tiny contribution, but we're only focusing on 20 to 30-year-old commercial office buildings, particularly in London, which have good credentials, where you can, you know, keep the frame and the infrastructure and replace as little as possible in terms of materials or recycle them, but basically strip out, you know, and at that stage, after 20 or 30 years, you know, these buildings, the mechanical, electrical plant and equipment has reached the end of its life. So you're going to have to throw it away anyway, even if you were going to replace it with fossil fuel motive power, so to speak. But, you know, now is the time when, you know, we actually replace it with, you know, heat pumps, whether they're air source or ground source. And, you know, it seems to me, and this is really the point of my question, well, the 2 points. First, you know, optimistically, I think there is acceptance amongst people who build buildings, people who own buildings, and people who occupy buildings. And, you know, the pressure is on because these buildings take, you know, a building takes between 5 and 10 years to come from an idea to maturity and actually be there physically. All the buildings, office buildings that are being finished now, there are virtually none of them that are truly climate change compliant, simply because they were designed 5 years ago. And this is a measure of what I was saying earlier, that the change in attitude has occurred within the last 5 years. But there are virtually no new buildings now that are being designed, which are not making a serious effort to comply. So that's a measure of the change, I think. So at the moment, we see it as a commercial opportunity that there are no buildings virtually like this, and you're playing into a market where, you know, people want to occupy climate change compliant buildings, and investors wish to own them, and so on. So, you know, it's turned into an interesting commercial opportunity in its own right, and that is important in making it happen. If this is to continue, the technology, you know, it's one thing. You know, of course, a lot of people say that heat pumps don't work very well. Actually, they do, and increasingly do, and they're getting increasingly better, because you're suddenly getting large flows of capital going into improving heat pumps, improving the software and the digital hardware. So it's, you know, it's two things. One, it's mechanical hardware, and the other bit is that software and the digital software that's important. One of the problems in the built world is extremely difficult to retrofit this equipment. The digital hardware and the software is not such a problem, but if you're looking at the mechanical electrical services, you've got a serious problem in actually doing it without, you know, having the whole building vacant. So this is a kind of a restraint on progress, if you like. But of course, all that will change. One of the things in the built environment in the commercial world, we have these sort of badges which are called BREEAM and neighbors and all this stuff. Nobody really knows what they mean. Nobody knows really what the standards are that they apply. So the last part of my question to you is do you think that government is going to come in and properly regulate what the emission standards are? Because there's going to be in the new breed of buildings, which have the right motive power and the right software operating it, there's going to be an enormous amount of data being chucked out of these buildings. Now, we know that everybody, the industry is out there to process data because, that's where Meta has made its money, in processing lots of bits of data. So the processing is not the problem. It's just against what you apply it, it seems to me. And I think if you're going to really make, this all work, you've got to have some standards against which you apply it, and then what it means if you don't comply with those standards. I mean, the government is sort of stumbling towards this, but I'm not sure they've quite got it right yet.
Thoughts in that, Edward? So let me just start off with, so you asked why we sort of reached a bit of a tipping point, certainly, as you say, in your industry, but I think it's across the board. So I would say that I think in terms of the big picture, what happened was that in 2015, Paris Agreement happened, and the negotiations around Paris were the first time that really the private sector started to be involved. They were, there were quite a lot of private sector participants in Paris, and then subsequent to Paris, the things like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was put in place, and that was a process that started to put climate change onto the agenda of organizations' boards. So that the very process of starting to put in place disclosure within companies' annual reports meant it became a board level discussion. And I think that in large part has been what's been the tipping point. And I don't think it's only in your industry at all. I hear it across the board.
Yeah.
In terms of where the current challenges are, as you say, there's increasing, at least in the UK, of course it's not true in all countries of the world, but at least in the UK and in many countries of the world, in the building sector, for example, there's increasing emphasis on sustainability. I think there's still real challenges in terms of retrofit. You mentioned that we've just done an exemplar retrofit of one of the listed buildings in Cambridge, and it's been a tortuous journey to get there. We've done it, but it's been very, very challenging, not least in terms of some of the constraints with planning regulations. There have been challenges simply on, for example, the windows. So the windows of the building originally were the sort of traditional Georgian windows. To retrofit it to passive house standards, which is what we've done. The advice was that we simply couldn't retrofit that type of window. We needed to do a full glass window instead. And that met with a lot of resistance from the planners because of the fact it's a listed building. Eventually we've done it, and we hope that will make it easier for other buildings to now do it because the precedent has been set, but there are these challenges. The other challenge is, and this I know is something that Trinity has been wrestling with and the university, is that often if there's a difficult to retrofit building, the easiest thing for us to do to reduce our overarching carbon footprint for the university is to offload that building, but then it becomes somebody else's problem instead. So that doesn't feel as though that's the responsible thing for us to be doing as the university or as the college. And so that challenge of the system as a whole needing to decarbonize rather than just bits within it is something that's going to continue to be a challenge. In terms of standards, I'm sure that there's going to be more standards, and actually the more progressive parts of the industry are going to be the ones that are probably going to be the loudest voices in calling for standards because that's going to then provide the differentiator for them.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, anyway, I think it is a reasonably optimistic picture with I think broad acceleration of acceptance, which will flatline from time to time, just as is happening now, as you've said. When you get a sort of major intervention like Russia invasion of Ukraine, everybody thinks energy security, cost of living, what the hell are we going to do? So, things flatline for a while, but it doesn't mean that the principle has been thrown away and it's not going to happen. It just might be delayed for 2 or 3, 4 years in terms of momentum, it seems to me.
Edward, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
In your, I don't know how much real estate or buildings you are responsible for, but do you have, what type of lighting do you have in your buildings?
Well, all the buildings that we're doing now are new buildings. So
okay.
I've now got, because all my involvements we disposed of over the last few years. So this is now a new enterprise, entirely focused upon, climate change compliance in buildings. And so it's a clean sheet of paper as to what we're doing. But what I can tell you is that whatever lighting systems are used, will be, of the most compliant category, because we want, just as you were talking about, using your West Cambridge campus as a sort of a test bed and an exemplar. We're trying within commercial boundaries to make what we're doing as much an exemplar as possible. I mean, there is always the danger in being an early mover that what you're doing costs more than it will do in 10 years' time, because with capital flowing in, prices will come down. I mean, there's just no question about it, and the equipment will become more efficient. But what we're trying to do is to future-proof these buildings as much as possible, because buildings have high obsolescence and moving parts, like motor cars, and so that's what we're pushing at.
Thank you.
The other thing that you mentioned was on the retrofit, one of the big challenges for college and the university is that if we want to do a major retrofit of any building, we need to vacate the building.
Yeah. Oh, no.
And it turns out that actually is just the logistics. I mean, that's probably the biggest challenge for us, is just the logistics of how do we move people around the university to vacate buildings so we can retrofit them.
No, it's a huge issue, because otherwise any building work, as we all know, from the smallest to the biggest, is fraught with complications, however simple it may seem. If you have people in occupation, I mean, it just goes crazy.
And one question that we're really wrestling with at the moment, this is more for the university than it is for the college, is that we haven't really settled into an understanding of what our building occupancy is going to be like post-pandemic, what people's working patterns are. I'm sitting in the computer lab right now. It's half empty still, more than half empty. And we don't really know how those buildings are being used or how we can restructure or repurpose them.
Do you know what was very interesting? The Vice Master, Louise, we had our previous discussion was with Louise Merritt, and she was saying she's creating a master plan for Trinity College. Maybe you're aware of that, where exactly these issues of building usage are under the new post or core COVID circumstances are looked at.
Yeah, no, it's the same for everyone. I'd say I think it's even more extreme at the university level, where you've got significant amount of office buildings that people are not currently using in the same way as they were before, and it seems unlikely that they're going to go back to using them in quite the same way they were before, but no one quite knows yet.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right, and this is an issue in the sector I work in. People are unsure. The pattern of work was changing before the pandemic, inexorably. The pandemic, like a war effect, accelerated that process. And tested the technology that people now use, what we're using now, and it was proved to broadly speaking, work. So the next test is really, but in the way Britain operates now, it's essentially a knowledge-based economy with services attached, and it's extremely difficult to where your product is a summary of ideas. And it's extremely difficult to do that. I mean, it's quite interesting now, but if one's to really synthesize a lot of stuff that's being talked about now, you actually have to meet, because you know, so there will be a place, call them offices, call them something else, don't know. But you know, people have to gather together to actually consolidate ideas, and you can't do it over email or whatever, you know. So it's shaking down. But you know, we see the commercial opportunity, because you know those patterns will change, producing continuing necessity for people to meet together and places for people to meet. But they will want to meet in an environment which is climate change compliant. You know, in the property industry, there's a sort of thing called ESG.
And Emily told me that she can only catch one more question. So,
oh no, I'm sorry. Let me go. I'll shut up now.
Sorry. I think Emily has another appointment coming up. So, Emily, how is it for? I'm sorry for interrupting you, Emily. How is it for time now?
Yeah, no, I'm sure that any minute I'm going to have a student knocking at my door because they've got a supervision.
Oh, okay. So can you take one more question?
I'll take one more question. Yes.
I think, Edward, let's keep that for email or other. If there's somebody else who has another question here, especially the younger people, like Kevin, do you have a question, for example? Kevin, are you here? Kevin? No? Oh, there's Philip is coming in now. Philip, I think you are too late to ask a question now, I guess. Okay, so in that case, Emily, I would like to thank you so very, very much for helping us understand what you and the University of Cambridge are doing in this enormously important topic, which is the number one topic, if we want it or not. It is the number one topic. So thank you so very, very much. And when you come to Tokyo, please let me know. And if you have free time, join us for a dinner meeting here in Tokyo.
It's been real pleasure to talk to you all today. And do any of you get in touch if you want to find out more or get involved in any of the things that we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.